Good evening. My name is Catherine Boyle, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the inaugural lecture of Professor Alan Reid, Stagehands, the Manual Labour of Performance. Before I go on, I'd like to introduce Dominique Ferdinand, who will interpret the event for us. Alan Reid was a graduate of the first year of the single honours drama degree at Exeter University and took a PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle. His first work involved coordinating the Council of Europe workshop on theatre and communities for Dartington College of Arts and co-editing with Peter Halton the publication of Theatre Papers. Alan Reid was the director of Rotherhithe Theatre Workshop in the Docklands area of South East London in the 1980s, a freelance writer on performance in Barcelona, and then director at the Institute of Contemporary Talks in the 1990s, and was appointed Roehampton's first Professor of Theatre in 1997. Since 2006, Alan Reid has been Professor of Theatre at King's, where, from the English department and through his work in the Performance Foundation, he has been developing King's approach to performance and theatre with his departmental and school colleagues. As part of this work, and in collaboration with the Centre for E-Research and King's Estates, the Anatomy Theatre Museum and Museum on the Strand, where we are now, and the Inigo Rooms in the East Wing of Somerset House have been developed to provide King's with publicly accessible venues for performance and cultural practice. He has just passed the halfway stage in a Labour Union-supported project called Engineering Spectacle, Inigo Jones Past and Present Performance at Somerset House. Alan is the author of many books. I'm just going to name a few just now. Author The Theatre and Everyday Life, An Ethics of Performance from 1993-95. Theatre, Intimacy and Engagement, The Last Human Venue from 2008-9. And he's the editor of The Fact of Blackness 1996 and Architecturally Speaking 2000. As a founding consultant editor of performance research, Alan has edited 2 issues of the journal on animals and on civility. He has worked as an advisor and collaborator with the Royal Society of Arts, Centre for Performance Research, London International Festival of Theatre, Live Arts Development Agency, Forced Entertainment and Platform. His current theatre research concerns the fate of the dramatically insignificant for a book entitled The Theatre and its Poor, Performance, Politics and the Powerless. And in 2013, Methuen will publish his collection of essays, Theatre in the Expanded Field, 7 Approaches to Performance. I'm particularly pleased to introduce Alan Reid because he has been, since his arrival at King's, an important force in the development of spaces for performance research and for reaching through research into the community around us. He has had and inspires a constant fascination with our buildings, with the site, its history, and how it exists in the world around it. And it is this that has driven so much of the work that has been done throughout the Strand campus over the last few years, including where we are this evening. Tonight's inaugural lecture, which I'm only going to introduce with the title, since I can't do any justice to its breadth and depth in one sentence, is entitled Stagehands, the Manual Labour of Performance. Professor Alan Reid.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Dominique, for coming. I am at the theatre. Jonathan Price is having trouble with his hands. Or Jonathan Price's hands are having trouble with Jonathan Price. Or Jonathan Price's hands are having trouble with King Lear. What I do know is that King Lear's hands are not having trouble with Jonathan Price. Or at least I don't think they are. These are decidedly not King Lear's hands I see before me. They are Jonathan Price's. Jonathan Price's hands are not what make Jonathan Price human. though philosophers for centuries, from Heraclitus to Heidegger, would like us to think so. For Heidegger, the hand is intimately connected to thinking. We act insofar as things present are within reach of the hand, and in so doing we disclose what was once concealed. The marks and signs that are formed by the demarcating hand, these inscriptions, are what Heidegger calls writing. It is this handwriting that makes visible the word, makes literature, and for Heidegger at least, makes human being possible. Heidegger's thinking is not merely humanist. It displays a hauteur that is hyper-humanistic. I would, however, concede that my ability mentally and linguistically to distinguish this hand from this one while holding them out in front of me might be a defining feature of humanity. At least that is what the philosopher G.E. Moore tried out in a lecture, not unlike this one, in 1939, just up the road. Moore was trying to prove in his lecture that things exist outside us, that there are things external to our minds. His proof for such external things was this. He said in that lecture, and I quote, "I can prove now that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. So there you are, there is a world beyond us." His lecture at the British Academy ran for 3 hours. Mine will be relieved to know is much shorter. It is an hour or so. So I do see on the sheet you're welcome to come and go as you please. But please don't go during the video block. You'll see twice during the talk this evening. He again, he was establishing proof of an external world. I'm wondering what's happened to Jonathan Pryce's hands. Despite what Heidegger and Moore suggest, there is good reason not to stake humanness on hands. Given our evolutionary history, we should not presume that a palm with 5 digits will survive for very long. Well, it might, just for tonight. That's why later, not just yet, the wine glasses have been designed as they have, for you to hold in a certain way, while king's caterers will persecute you by inviting you to manage a vol-au-vent. Humans are not currently well adapted to receptions, and were never meant to be vol-au-vent. But in the longer term, I mean, for instance, just a few million years ago, there were countless species of snake and serpent that had many feet, in some cases hundreds of feet. In time, they sloughed these off to allow their dorsal identity to prevail. The spinal suppleness of the snakes we know today, with their extraordinary virtuosity of movement across ground. There should be no presumption as to which way things will go for Jonathan Pryce's hands. Over time, his ancestors might develop more digits, or as Snake showed with digital regression, less might be more. So I wouldn't want to mislead you in this talk by letting you think for a moment that I associate humanity with hands, no more than I associate performance with people. This, I hope, will not be too sentimental a journey, though the last section of this talk will try your patience. You're about to get a drink after that, so it should be fun. In my work of writing over the last 5 years since coming to King's, I've taken Judith Butler rather literally when at the close of her essay, Precarious Life, she writes the following, I quote, "If the humanities has a future as cultural criticism, and cultural criticism has a task at the present moment, it is no doubt to return us to the human, where we do not expect to find it, in its frailty, and at the limits of its capacity to make sense. We would have to interrogate the emergence and vanishing of the human at the limits of what we can know, what we can hear, what we can see, and what we can sense. For me, those limits start with Jonathan Pryce's hands." There are 5 parts to this talk this evening, which reflect various interests and commitments that I have made in this pursuit, principally concerning performance in politics, history, and life. In keeping with my published work, which has never subscribed to the idea that there is a single tone or voice that is necessarily appropriate for subject matter, any more for an academic than an artist, whatever those two signs might suggest to you, I will be ranging between the impersonal at the outset, a quite intense and difficult part of the talk, to the deeply personal by the close. If I had another hour, which of course if this were one of my lecture courses at King's I would have next week, I would of course commit to coming back the other way with the students, which would quite properly put everything into question that I choose to share with you now. I've included some acknowledgements on the handout, but I'm especially grateful to Dominic Ferdinand, who will be signing this talk, to Kelvin Sang, who is conjuring some images, to Catherine for introducing me, and to my old friend Joe Kelleher, who will offer some words by way of response at the end. And thank you all for coming. If I invited you, I'm indebted to you. As indeed I'm indebted to my partner, Beryl Robinson, who's here this evening, who has taken time from her own work, whose work between hand, eye and feeling is presented here, who has supported me throughout with her critical care, to Hermione, who designed my presentation and provided the stage for Florence to appear on towards the close of this presentation. Don't worry, I'm paying them both the going rate. Okay, let's get going. The first part of my talk is called Actor. To be honest, I'm not really interested in Jonathan Pryce's hands, in and of themselves. I must admit, I've only ever been interested in theatre and its various parts, in so much as it permits me to feel, to think, to say and to write things I might otherwise have felt, thought, said and written, but more acutely. In this sense, performance has simply done what other arts are too coy to admit to. Performance is a register of exaggeration, modest acts of upscaling that materially reduces the distance between things, brings things closer together in order that we might perceive them in the same place and at the same time. I am interested in these hands inasmuch as they allow me to think of the figure to whom someone gave the name Jonathan Pryce, as a person, not as a human, nor a citizen, certainly not as a character, but something that modulates between these various entities, and I'm going to call that a person who acts, or more accurately, an actor who, in doing so, becomes some sort of person, an other person. Following an idea first developed by the linguist Emile Benveniste and picked up by the philosopher Roberto Esposito, I would like to suggest we call this figure not Jonathan Pryce, nor King Lear, but a third person. What Jonathan Pryce's hands are telling me is that his role, a performance by nature of his situation, is also a performative, a form of language combining gestures and words productive of real effects. These effects, which are affecting me, have something to do with a continuously recurring separation between a character, given the name King Lear by Shakespeare, and a person to whom you might be inclined to give the name Jonathan Pryce. But as I said, I want you to resist doing that for a moment, as it will be difficult to get back to Jonathan Pryce's hands if you go down that particular route. The person I witness, falteringly emerging before me in this play, is striking me at this moment with the hands as the more artificial entity among those present. This feeling is compounded by these hands, reminders of the human as a natural being, for whom the status of person may or may not be in question. To be the owner of this body, let us say these hands for a start, the person, as far as I can see from the stalls, cannot for some reason be coextensive with it. The person in this theatrical setting is specifically defined now by the distance that separates it from this body, these hands. And I'm discomforted by this distance, measuring my own distances to this stalling of identity from a distance, not least of all looking down at my own hands. Never mind catharsis. I suspect this looking away is one reasonable side effect of tragedy. This separation is amplified in the scene I'm talking about by costume. Jonathan Pryce's hands sit at the end of a doublet and hose arrangement in universal plaiage that is the sine qua non of a certain kind of Shakespearean production. Meanwhile, Edgar, as brought on in the same scene, is unclothed above his belt, and it is hard to identify where hand ends and arm begins, though his skin is the same plaiage, which further unsettles me. The words Lear is speaking are complicating this further. They are prose, not poetry, which separates them from what has come before, from somewhere around his face. And while peripheral for me with regards to what makes this scene theatre, are nevertheless just surviving the hands that are waving the words on their way to me. I will read them from the Arden edition I used as my A-level text at school, annotated in capitals with the confidence of a 17-year-old who knew nothing about this play. Shakespeareans here, and Aaron Thompson, general editor of the Arden Shakespeare, was instrumental in encouraging me to apply for this chair of Kings when it's advertised, will notice the paucity of my A-level efforts, as represented by the very thin marginalia. Let's see how I get on with rendering the words as distinct to the text. Thou were better in a grave than to answer with thy uncovered body this extremity.
of the skies. Poor Tom has just emerged from a fissure, a rend in the stage, a trapdoor in the earth. Is man no more than this? Consider him well. Thou owest the worm no silk, the beast no hide, the sheep no wool, the cat no perfume. Hark, here's to we ones are sophisticated, thou art the thing itself, unaccommodated man, is no more but such a poor, bare, fault animal as thou art. Off, you lemmings, come, unbutton here. But why then do I insist on this naughty night, as the fool puts it, on referring to Jonathan Pryce in the third person, or even as the third person? Surely at the theatre we have commonly figured the rest of the audience as the he, the she, the it, or the they that is not you, communing as you are with the first person on the stage, the I, Jonathan Pryce, that speaks to you. But I want this evening at least to refer to him, them, actors up there in this way, not to be disrespectful, but because they show me something crucial for our future about the impersonal, the potential of the impersonal in an increasingly personalised world. I didn't advertise this event on Facebook for fear that my friends would turn up. An increasingly personalised world has never perhaps felt more impersonal, where our supposedly defining human hands have provided the very means to dehumanise us. This dehumanisation begins, perhaps ironically, with Charles Darwin's cousin, this man, Francis Galton, who in the 1870s began to work on a fingerprinting classification system which would allow for criminalisation without recognition of a person's face. A system that was specifically designed to apprehend what were described as natives from the colonies, whose physical characteristics tended to be confusing and appeared indistinguishable to a European police eye, and to apprehend prostitutes at the time, whose long hair, according to the authorities, made measurements difficult to take accurately. For the first time in the history of humanity, identity was no longer a function of the social persona and its recognition by others, an essentially performative act, but rather a function of biological data which could bear no relation to it. In this process, we literally lost touch with our own means of identification. Today, the entrance to high school cafeterias prepare children as young as Hermione here tonight and her friends for their fate in this respect, installing regulating means of biometric apparatus upon which students distractedly place their hands, while busy insisting in archaic conversation that they still do recognise each other, and those who are serving them sustenance. But back to the theatre. In a binary world of the theatre in which actors and audiences will appear to take precedence, the third person is critical. Just to complicate things, now we're warming up, the third person I would like to propose is not actually another person with respect to the first and second, but rather something that extends out of the logic of the persons here, the audience in favour of a different regime of meaning. The actor is thus not another person to be added to the first two, but something that is rather neither one nor the other. It defies all dichotomies founded on or presupposed by the language of the person. For this reason, actors like Jonathan Pryce, in my view, are not located at any point in the expected proximate relation that we think of when we say theatre, but most definitely outside interlocution. Actors become an outside. Given this radical breach of the two-way dialogical model we presuppose theatre to inaugurate, various theatre approaches would seem to have attempted to tame its successes for all its disruptive effects. Actor training that involves concepts of century is a prime example. Meanwhile, performance has, of course, contrarily, though not always relished, its disruptive effects, without carefully enough considering its binding, conserving, and often conservative implications. I'm beginning to sense, if not understand, why Jonathan Pryce's hands were causing so much trouble. His hands, of course, any actor's hands, represent the obvious opportunity and most obvious means to reach out towards us, even to touch us, or be touched. But more importantly than this rather obviously romantic association, an observation that's been fetishized in the century or more of attempts to reduce distances between audiences and performers, from Sergei Eisenstein to Uni Lamont, we should not ignore the rather obvious point that I'm making here, that any relation through theatre is as likely to be one of the registration and measurement of degrees of immunity as celebrations of community. Now, this is important to me, and I think it should be important to us all, if performance is our thing. For it is this person, the one with the hands, that causes so much trouble for me in the economy of representation, who does not identify themselves through their gestures, but chooses not to reach for us, rather away from us, rather makes what I would like to call, using an art historical term, a rend in the stage image, through which I can begin to perceive, faintly at first, sometimes with a blur, often partially, and with much peering, though not enough touching, possibilities that might be open to persons in such situations, concrete ones, such as this in the theatre. This is what I think performance is. Not what is inside, that will take care of itself, but the rent. The rent in the fabric of theatre is, for me at least, performance. And it is this rent that will run through this talk, a rent that I hope you will not take at face value, but will put into doubt as I try to locate it in various places. The second part of my talk is called animism. Politically speaking, I could re-register what I've just said theatrically, using Jonathan Pryce as a prop, in more animistic terms as follows. This is a slightly shorter section. Just as humans don't need hands to be humans, persons do not need humans to be persons. Humans become persons at various moments in which their rights are recognized, but can just as quickly, of course, become less than persons, as the history of the 20th century revealed. Indeed, human rights are no longer extended to individuals because they are citizens, but of course rather because they are persons. The category of the person in the 21st century appears to be the only one that can unite human beings and citizens, body and soul, law and life. But it is nevertheless, performance notwithstanding, a category at the heart of which is an almost wholly unquestioned assumption. No matter which department you went to in King's College, philosophy, theology, law, bioethics, it is personhood that remains the basis legitimizing every theoretically correct discourse. Yet it is a category that would strangely appear in each of these otherwise exemplary departments to appear to require no further proof. The evidence of the history of the last decade, I suggest, demands otherwise. Performance, whether you call it King Lear or Franco B, if it is concerned with anything, is concentrated almost wholly on a life's entrance into the regime of personhood, somewhere around the red I'm talking about. Not as an unquestionable value, but as something that is put at stake. It is perhaps a horrible irony that simultaneously with the scandalous loss of personhood across the globe that escalates today, through local examples such as strip mining in Nauru, oil-powered levelling of communities in Nigeria, work the platform has been doing, extraordinary work, members of the platform here tonight, in and around those issues and political questions, genocidal militarism in Syria. There has been an equivalent during this period of dehumanization. There has been an equivalent and reciprocal expansion and extension of personhood to any number of previously organic and inorganic things. Thus, although animals have long been considered persons, inasmuch as they've been granted rights for more than 100 years, much longer than children, for instance, the RSPCA was founded in the 19th century, fully 20 years before the NSPCC. Certainly, we also, if we claim any environmental credentials at all, recognize plants, insects and bacteria, virus and provirus, as well as natural formations like rainforests, mountains, oceans and rivers, as entities worthy of our own concern. Entities that are to different degrees arguably sentient. The issue is not, to put it crudely, whether these animals and others are people too. The issue rather, as Anthony Kubiak has argued recently, is to recognize that the impulse in humans towards recognition, something called personness, not mere subjectivity or worse subject position, is an impulse that is not necessarily bound to notions of what constitutes the human, of the humanist traditions, the one I was talking about earlier, the one with hands. This much has been said many times in recent decades and might account for the pervasive spread of animal studies, or criticism as I like to call it, in the performance field. But its animist implications have not perhaps been taken seriously enough. No, the recognition of personness grows out of the propensity to be concerned about precisely another. Not a bad starting point, I would have said, for both an interest in theatre, but also an understanding of why performance itself is a critical touchstone for any university of the 21st century that takes seriously a grave problem. Judith Butler was precisely speaking about the university when in Precarious Life she wrote, I quote, "The structure of address is important for understanding how moral authority is introduced and sustained if we accept not just that we address others when we speak, but that in some way we come to exist, as it were, in the moment of being addressed, and something about our existence proves precarious when that address fails." The sociology can tell us about alienation, the psychology can tell us about anxiety, the medicine can tell us about arthritis. It's not in doubt in the university. But few, if any, of these disciplines can quite encourage us to care in the way that performance links evidence and experience in uniquely affective ways. What precisely is at stake then in its turn to animism I'm advocating here? Well, that, I'm afraid, is what I'm touching on through the first part of this talk this evening. It is certainly not the old animism, a return to some atavistic belief in spirits that inhabit inanimate objects. This might be helpful in getting to grips with certain worldviews, but it is simply wrong, and it is a misinformed view of those worldviews. Rather, animism now pulls together recognition of an interbeing of the world. The animist stance is just that, a stance, an attitude of openness, a fundamentally affective and thus aesthetic worldview, but one which comes about through the partial and temporary suspension of ideological or categorical states of mind. The new animism is less a view or belief system than it is a conscious enactment, a performance, an inherent relationality infused with awareness. I think that describes what performance can bring to the academy. And I'm afraid for the romantic and the communitarian in me, this has to start with the potential of the impersonal, or the impotential of the personal, if it is not to subside into a solipsistic, romantic self-regard. It is in this climate of simultaneous retraction and expansion, proximity and distance, personal and impersonal, that any conversation concerning the merits or not of performance could be conducted today. There are many of us at work at this front. Claire MacDonald has called it radical inclusion, and many in this room this evening who have insisted through their efforts that such endeavours might be worthy of recognition by the Academy. I suppose this evening's inauguration is just one such recognition among many, which I'm not so much wholly personally pleased, though of course I am, but happy on behalf of what some of us do. So what do we do? What is worth doing under the sign of performance? This is what begins to occur to me in the theatre watching Jonathan Pryce's Hands. I'm sorry to insist on dragging us back into the theatre, but performance has struck me as being at its most interesting over the last 3 decades in its meeting with that consistent anachronism. In this theatrical scene involving Edgar as Porton and Lear, I find myself thinking about Jonathan Pryce's Hands by way of diversion from what I've been invited to look at, through something that directors do, though by no means all directors, I must stress. This work of the director is called blocking. Much of this administration of the stage, this manual labour, is quite happily for me, because I enjoy these complications at the theatre, getting in my way, or getting in the way of some sounds, which include words, but might also be poetry. One side effect of this blocking is that by way of trying to keep my mind on the job rather than think about any number of other things, including this inaugural lecture, which is barely a week away, I turn my attention to the hands. Here they begin to take on the function of an impersonal prop, like the samovar in a Chekhov play, that roves around the stage and is worth tracking for how those who are seeking to relate to each other in The Three Sisters of the Cherry Orchard relate to it, the samovar, like a 19th century Warmian version of the office water cooler, the centre of all things. In the case of these hands, I'm drawn to them because they are about as far away as I can look from the actor Jonathan Pryce, by which I mean his beard, without simply giving up on the thrashing figure in front of me and turning my attention to the walls, which at the Almeida Theatre in general, and in this King in particular, are really, well, there's no adjective for it, than woolly. The stage is just full of walls, and there are walls as far as you can see. There are hands and there are walls. On this night, in this show, I'm being disturbed by the hands and the walls. Animism thus moves us away from the central image of consuming culture. There is far too much happening on this stage to presume I could consume anything, rather than what I'm describing here, an intense state of dissolution, subsuming and being subsumed within ever-widening spheres of responsibility to these hands and walls. Here there are walls touched by an animist sensibility. There are, you could say, walls that talk, and there are hands that reach out for those walls. Just in case you're not sure what the first half of this talk was about, animism, the red, the third person, or quite, it gets a bit easier later closer to the brains, or third person, or quite fairly, whether what I'm describing exists at all. Let's watch literally someone jumping through this red to the far side and back. This is Lassoon by the Finnish image maker Salatika, and the piece lasts about 3 minutes. is called audience. Nick, are you okay? All right. I'm in a university. Hands might not necessarily be human, but putting things on walls, or simulations of walls like blackboards, is what makes humans cultural animals. Living between walls, as humans tend to do, appears to encourage most humans to strive to make the best of them. I've used this as my defense since coming to King's, and for the last 5 years insisting that it is the archaeological animation about architecture that will best provide for performance. Sheila Anderson and I dedicated 2 years to these walls here, and then unable to learn a simple lesson, I dedicated the next 2 years with Catherine Rapson-Stark, who's here this evening, Lucia Duku and Catherine Boyle, to the walls of the East Wing of Somerset House. Sorry, Georgina. When the Queen recognised our work on these walls by opening the Inigo rooms last February, it struck me as I took her gloved hand in mine more subserviently than I would have thought possible for this Republic. I'm not showing you that picture. I'm curtsying very deep. But Walter Benjamin was always right about gloves in a short aphorism. He wrote, gloves. In an aversion to animals, the predominant feeling is fear of being recognized by them through contact. The horror that stirs deep in man is an obscure awareness that something living within him is so akin to the disgust-arousing animal that it might be recognized. All disgust is original disgust at touching. We can guess all we like, but we only know one political attitude held by the Queen, thanks to the BBC security correspondent, Frank Bell. And that is that she has an attitude about this man, Abu Hamza al-Masri. They are equally human to me, precisely because they are apparently humans without hands, as we might expect them in our conformity to appear. But only one of them shares a fear with the snake, whose feet wasted away. It is the Queen, who represents an atrophying social organism, the British monarchy, that becomes increasingly powerless or even entirely defunct, and yet persists in its pageantry by way of masking the rise of its other radical feminism. They are intimately bound by acclamations of power and glory, that we will come back to by way of conclusion in a more modest setting, acclamations that remind us of the theological root of all politics today. But where was I? I was touching on walls. Should you be at home later this evening watching your recordings of the Great British Bake Off final, or Poland versus England, and one of your walls be removed and the room you're in become exposed to the world outside, a little like the transparent wall of Finnish modernist architecture we saw earlier, the space that was once a room with mediating walls would now resemble the stage of a theatre upon which your moves, your feelings, and your words would become the start of comedy or tragedy. A performance for those beyond the fourth wall that has disappeared. For those whom we might call here, for want of a better word, an audience. If you make lots of tea in that samovar maybe and constantly discuss moving to a nearby city, the name for what you're doing is the free system. If you're an older man and had an argument with your daughters, you do not have to be Jonathan Price for an onlooker to call you King Lear. You actually probably do have to be Jonathan Price. I won't go into details about the social conditions that might pass in this room for Antigone, given what happened after she was walled up, but you can guess. You don't have to step outside to imagine what the walls of your home look like, even when one has disappeared. The reason that you can conjure this up is that you have an idea of what a wall looks like. You could call this an ideal kind of wall. When you have this idea, it does not have to subscribe to the look, scale, or elevation of the peculiarly institutional walls you're looking at now. In this sense, we are all still cavemen of sorts, or cave persons at least. Troglodytes, whose relationship with the walls within which they lived, the walls they decorated with handprints, in their caves in Kashmir, for instance, was part of a continual effort not to take quite as much for granted about what protected them from the elements and the animals outside, That is, the elements and animals that they knew existed beyond the gaping aperture at the end of the cave where there was no wall. And we are still cave of thoughts or cave people, to the degree that our understanding of what constitutes a community beyond these walls that are now at the end of our privacy remains limited by a failure of imagination that shapes everything performance can reasonably do. When humans first blew earth-red pigment from their mouths towards their hand, placed upon the cave wall, they were doing what we have been doing to the walls around us ever since. But 40,000 years ago, in those caves of Peshmer and Chauvet, humans stepped back and away from that wall, removing their hand, and in that moment witnessed themselves at a distance for the first time, now an onlooker to what was their own handprint, and now part of a larger composition. Is it fanciful, the writer Marie-José Monzin asked in this room last February, with Joe Kelleher sitting by her side, to consider this very action the invention of the spectator? I'd like to take Monzin's imaginative proposition seriously and try to push it a little further than might be expedient. She does, after all, describe her writing in the cave as a fable, so this part of my talk might have to be taken for what it is, a prehistory of performance that will have to remain on the side of fantasy. A curious register, perhaps, for an inaugural lecture in an institution that boasts empirical inaugurals by the inventor of the battery, Daniel, the inventor of the telegraph, Wyckoff, and the discoverer of electromagnetism, Clark Maxwell. But despite this cautionary note, I've never taken that much notice of those people A.B. Warburg described as the border police, the designated team of academic patrol officers who demand to examine our papers and check our credentials whenever we attempt to exit from our assigned areas of research. The passing or trespassing of such perennial checkpoints must surely become the work of our scholarly reanimation in this field of all fields. Now, after Monzin, I want to ask, is this the moment when Homo faber, the one who works, or Homo ludens, the one who plays, becomes Homo spectator, the one who watches? And then, of course, I want to ask, what might Homo spectator be looking at? It took just 37,000 years for someone to write an answer down to that question. An answer that survived the travails of climate, the vicissitudes of war, the precariousness of what had to remain prehistory, because there was as yet no retrievable record. It was Plato, the Greek philosopher, who wrote a story about this spectator that for 2 millennia has captured the popular imagination, which is surprising, given it took place in a dank, dark cave. For some, the story will be about as familiar as the walls we've taken for granted. But for others, the story, as Plato conceived it, goes like this. Picture men dwelling in a sort of subterranean cave, with a long entrance open to the light on its entire width. Conceive them as having their legs and necks fettered from childhood, so they remain in the same spot, able to look forward only, and prevented by the fetters from turning their heads. Picture further the light from a fire burning higher up and at a distance behind them, and between the fire and the prisoners and above them a road, along which a low wall has been built, as the exhibition of puppet shows have partitions before the men themselves, above which they show their puppets. All that I see, replies Glaucon, as Socrates continues describing something that years later surely influenced the producers of the generation. See also then men carrying past the wall implements of all kinds, the right above the wall, and human images and shapes of animals as well, wrought in stone and wood, and every material, some of these bearers presumably speaking, and others with silence. A strange image you speak of, Glaucon said, and strange prisoners. Like to us, says Socrates. For to begin with, tell me, do you think that these men would have seen anything of themselves or of one another except the shadows cast from the fire on the wall of the cave of the fire? How could they, Glaucon said, if they were compelled to hold their heads unmoved through life? The dialogue continues, raising the spectre that the handheld shadows seen on the wall of the humans, animals, and objects, the sound echoing from the wall from their cries, could be perceived by the prisoners as a reality. This illusion, as Plato wants to encourage his reader to think of it, would only be dispelled should the prisoners be released from their chains, to see for the first time their own situation, and to emerge from the cave into the sunlight that would illuminate things as they are. Despite some other benefits that Plato brought to the table, it has to be admitted at this point The performance in general, and theatre in particular, is not getting the best of starts here in the philosophical record. But Plato's antagonism to the mimetic practices to which we have given names such as performance and theatre, his preference was for terms in Greek with the translations poetry and dance, was contrarily perhaps the best possible start to defending performance from its detractors. A remorseless and continuous detraction that was described by Jonas Barish as anti-theatrical prejudice. A prejudice that I hope you recognise alive and well and informing my earlier discussion of Jonathan Pryce's Hands. So before we leave the cave for supposed enlightenment, where we all consensually agree that performance, if not theatre, is a very good thing, we should dwell on the scene in the cave that, like the walls around us, we have perhaps taken for granted. It is a most peculiar scene, and especially so when coming to it, as many of us do in this room tonight, as those who work in and through performance, who cherish what is special about performance and its publics, beyond the privacy of their walls. But if this caved-in life is the stuff of illusions, where does that leave performance, not just in Plato's ideal republic, but for us, wherever we are now? The cave that Plato has Socrates described is a particular kind of theatre, or a particular interpretation of a theatre. It is unmistakably a theatre nonetheless, and there are two things that mark it out as such for the writer Samuel Weber, that have nothing to do with the upsetting fact that Plato mentions puppets, strange hand-manipulated figures we are all understandably dubious about from early childhood. First, we are invited to picture a defined limited place, a positioning of the people and things that are constitutive of what is taking place there. This is the first characteristic of a theatre. The events it depicts are not indifferent to their placement. It must be admitted that in this myth, the cavern has been fabricated. It is a theatre in which the prisoners see a highly organised, staged spectacle. Shadows are apprehended as reality because a fire, which is natural, has been set up precisely to create bizarre effects. It has been placed behind them in such a way as to be unavailable to them, yet to deliver its special effects. The second theatrical trait in this famous scene is the no less constitutive role of spectators. A theatrical scene, after all, is one that plays to others, called variously spectators, with a subtle difference to those among sound identified in the cave. For given sound is involved here too, perhaps audience might be more accurate a description. But what is unsettling here is that Plato's protagonists are spectators of a very peculiar kind. They are literally riveted to their places. They are prisoners unaware of their imprisonment. They have been there since childhood. So it's not quite as riveting as the mousetrap, which seems to have been going on for an eternity, but almost. But crucially for my discussion this evening, it should be noted that not all the inhabitants of the cave are fixed to the ground, or to their seats, or however they are riveted. There are also, importantly for me, if less so for Plato, a shadowy group of stagehands who carry things past this wall, artists or roadies, whose handiwork brings these scenes about. It's hard to quite know how Plato conceives of these on the one hand free, but labouring others on behalf of the illusion. They're not riveted. How do these people relate to the spellbound audience of spectator prisoners? How do they relate to the organisation of the spectacle itself? Plato is resistant to such questions of theatre and theatrical labour, as his metaphysical pursuit of the truth would be seriously derailed if he had to admit that this whole scene is one dependent on an external economy of market forces. Like all the best cultural acts, this one cannot be free of an outside, however inside it would appear. And this provides us with a second serious problem in taking Plato for performance of these two prescriptively. Despite the fact that this myth forms part of the work, painstakingly detailing the ideal republic, it does seem very sketchy indeed on what passes for the conditions of cultural production that would prevail in any such republic. Performance has been figured from the outside here as something free, floating from economic determinants. Those acting are literally shadowy figures who are unlikely to have the benefit of a trade union, such as equity to support them. Should an extra show be added at the last minute to cater for an upswing in prisoners? And the audience would appear to be here free to remain as long as they have to, at show after show, despite the obvious fact that they're imprisoned and do not appear to have bought any tickets. A living hell indeed. 24/7 applied theatre in prisons. If ever there was a more derogatory founding myth for drama in cultures beyond the Greco-Roman European, it would be hard to imagine. Plato's well-known fear of the rowdy rabble, an audience legitimated in its less than ideal behaviours by the theatre, might provide a clue as to why he drove his protagonist here inland, away from the threat of the sea and the tumultuous anarchy of the sailors that he had been parodying earlier in the life, with their conflicting demands and navigational ineptitudes, and he buried his story deep down, apparently beyond external witness. I say apparently because, contrary to our popular presumption as to what makes for a decent cave, this is not a self-contained space. It has a long entrance, open to the light on its entire width, a rent in the earth between soil and sky. Plato says it, not me, and in doing so he gives away his reluctance to bury bad news for the Republic quite as securely as he would appear to suggest. This is very surprising indeed, and is hardly ever mentioned in commentaries on this episode. Indeed, it never is. It does not perhaps quite suit our stereotype of a cave that this cave, Plato's cave, should be so explicitly open, seared by this rent to its outside. If it has an entrance opening up to its entire width, as Plato puts it, it sounds not that different to this room, should this whole surface drop away, which, given the challenges we face with its rebuilding, is not impossible tonight. It is certainly, at the very least, a very open prison. Plato's opening allows me to ignore his intemperate insistence on cutting this cavernous theatre off from its world, his attempt to figure the shadowy theatre in stark contrast to immutable truth in the glare of the sun. It compels me to evoke a less metaphysical, more material alternative to this tale, on behalf of performance, and in distinction to Plato's theatre. So here is my fable, my fantasy. It is called the work of art in the age of manual reproduction. It is late summer, somewhere outside Athens, and the sun, the same one that Plato wrote about, is still shining down upon the shepherds and their flocks, well into the evening. On their way from their country round, their transhumance, moving sheep from the cool high pastures of the summer to the lower valleys of the autumn, two of these shepherds, let us call them the Athenian and Cytheron, are observed by an onlooker. Let us call him Sophocles, who is adjusting his eyes to the glare of the sun, having spent some time in the darkened room. He sees them passing a baby in finely clothes between them. They are in a forest that's close to the cave Sophocles has just been persuaded, against his better judgment, to leave. After the baby has been passed from the one to the other, the shepherd with the baby continues on his way, but soon arrives at the cave. The shepherd also knows it well, having spent some contented years there, before being manhandled from his seat and expected to make a living above. He would not have noticed Sophocles during his time alone, given his perpetually stiff neck. The shepherd looks in through the inviting opening that runs the width of this cave, to see what is happening in the flickering space, inviting because humans and animals are involved in the spectacle as always. And after a summer high in the mountains, with only sheep for company, the shepherd can't wait for some human-on-human action, even if it does involve puppets, as it always does. As the shepherd stands on the threshold of the cave, with baby in arms, he pauses to look into the Stygian gloom through a tear in the cave. The spectacle has reached a good bit, or at least everyone is laughing. As they enter the cave down a long road between the backlit fire and the low wall, the baby, who the shepherd does not know is called Oedipus, cries out. No one turns from the screen. They are riveted. Part 4, Acknowledgement. We are back at school. A child of 5 years, who happens to be our daughter, and mine as sister, walks from somewhere off to somewhere on, and accustoms herself to being watched. This acclimatization has already begun between the off and the on, and first manifests itself in her eyes. They are averted from the habitual assimilation of childhood that links foreground and distance, a visual dexterity that can give the youthful that magical air of insouciance, just beyond and out of reach of the adult, whose imagination fails to imagine the child's imagination in its myriad pleasures and fears. Florence looks at her hands. She studies their peculiar asymmetry, tracing the junction between line lines with her finger. This means of telling the future, her potential subjectivity, is yet to be qualified by any sense of what her future might be, beyond this moment, which brings with it the imperative of performance. This is her first theatre, and the lifeline is about to multiply, proliferate. This is occurring at the very moment she has the strongest desire to resign, to return behind the doors to the off from where she has come. The examination of her hand complete, Florence looks up and out for the first time since entry, recognizing a certain betrayal has been visited upon her. The fleece she wore in the wings among friends is out in the open among strangers who appear to have nothing in common, conspicuous, drawing too much attention. As she looks into this attention, a frisson is discernible. Looking at dissolves into looking towards. Tears welling in her eyes, the need to find someone among everyone overwhelms her. Who is shattered? Her eyes move to and fro across the surface of the strangers, who return her mute appeal with an anonymous and tacit recognition that she is looking in the right direction, but in the wrong place. We are singing in the third-person narrative that separates us from the first-person mimesis that Plato figured. We are the impersonal now. Once in royal David City stood a lowly cattle shed where a mother laid her baby in a manger for his bed. She continues scanning despite the noise. Why not call out over here? She looks to her mother and then sees me, or sees a face with a camera, and measures me in her memory against a man she once knew who was not a spectator, satisfying herself we are the same species, if now apparently very distantly related. As though a sighting is not sufficient, an acknowledgement of presence ensues. Florence raises her hand above her head and waves. I lift my hand to return her wave, which I take it as expectant of a reciprocal gesture. Her wave flourishes while mine mimics. Returning the favour is to notice a false economy that is already at play between performer and audience. The excess inherent in stage wave rolls off the shallow apron and down into the auditorium, engulfing those looking for their own. The returning ripple barely reaches its intended, but disintegrates somewhere around her feet. Only later do I discover why this might be. My wave is saying hello, it greets and welcomes, intended to draw us closer, it falls short, because it falsely believes it is reciprocating, in an equivalent manner, the wave that the child offers. But Florence tells me, and it surprises me, that her wave is not saying hello, but goodbye. She was bidding us farewell from the beginning. This was the first time I had heard this, and though I wanted to resist its implications, realized it opened up a child's performance to some intriguing possibilities. If the entrance of a child to performance is simultaneously an exit, from where does the child believe they might have come in order to be, and where might they be intending to go? If Emmanuel Levinas is right, the vulnerability is being able to say adieu to this world. There is perhaps a small death, an expiration being played out here. Of course, in French, the salutation adieu can equally mean hello. I can see you. I see you're there. As it can also stand as the salutation at the moment of separation, at the moment of death. But with children, the fear of death cannot surely be for their life, but the palpable sense of not having lived. And in this nativity, adieu is also implicitly more literally to God, like the idiomatic English greeting, God bless, bestowing the performance of it to a higher patronage, higher even than the head teacher, sitting in the front row, indicating with her hand to Florence to lower her hand. A child's wave in performance is a form of idea that simultaneously welcomes and acknowledges, recognises the presence of another, all in the process of leave-taking. Like the wave of a child on a roller coaster or the carousel at the fair, the marking of presence is a preparation for their disappearance from your sight. And given that optometric measure is all to the child, life. Their heart is left somewhere behind them, and this physiological experience might not be wholly disassociated with the child entering the performance. The rush they perceive from being present to an audience is the sound of a shedding, a sloughing of identities, forged through the relations who are present, and the assumption of identities from elsewhere, in this instance, from the animal and the animistic. The wave of a child, if indeed it is an adieu, recognises the significance of this relationship while committing the parent to their place in the audience at a distance where the impersonal is needed. The wave of this child reaches beyond the known body, not to a freedom but towards a stricter directive, an imperative to perform within the bounds offered by caste. She is a she, after all. Alfonso Lingus puts it this way: when we set out to feel something, our extending hand locates the level of the tangible, which it makes contact with not as an object, but as our directive, imposing the pressure, sweep, and periodicity of the movement that will distinguish the grain of the wood, the fur of the animal, or the braille letters on the surface of the page. The hand that waves may be bidding adieu, but it also describes the arc of an animal-human relation, a rent within which child's leave-taking becomes possible. This is where Florence is going, towards the seduction of an animal, whose breath confounds subjectivity, whose familiarity becomes an imperative, the imperative of another, to which we give the name alterity. While Once in Royal David City reaches its final stanzas, a nativity at a safe platonic distance, A Child's Wave marks a provocation in the Republic of Play, the second nature of Nemesis. The condition of this performance is one, then, suspended between the contingency of humanity on animality. After all, the Epiphany reveals a creature in a manger. This insistent alterity is peculiarly suited to childhood rendering, situated as it is at the crossroads between a myriad free-form animal becomes and the directives associated with theatre conventions. It is the ideal performance primer for this transitionary world between infant mimesis and youth theatre. The freedom of earlier multiple animal associations in play here becomes the setting for certain things that Alfonso Lingus says summon us into their own settings, and each summons us to forget the rest and devote ourselves to it. It is this freedom and this summoning that the Child's Wave articulates. The Kantian recognition that immediacy to where and when I am makes what has to be done what I have to do. These categorical imperatives are practical necessities. They're not aesthetic niceties, and for a child will always prevail over what is undoable. This is why a Child's Wave initiates an act of theatre that is never less than perfect. It is essential the child realises this, and not that. The Child's Wave is momentary and lost as the consciousness of theatre convention expands in direct reciprocation to performance's loss of perfection. It spills out in later years as a certain kind of faster acknowledgement in that curtain call, in the stage door greeting, in the sidewalk of Hollywood Boulevard, and in the infusions of award ceremonies. The star that once hung so languidly above the stable with such limpid ferocity, calling out to the kings, "Follow me," now looks out from the Hollywood stage, clutches her Best Actress Oscar for Love and Shakespeare, and evokes her dead cousin Keith. She has out-alterited all comers, her mother, father, brother, uncle, agent are all responsible for her presence. Strapped now in $20,000 worth of Jimmy Choo, open-toed sandal, Christian Dior, and chained at the ankle, this star cries out, tethered, anguished, Jack Nicholson will arrive soon to put her out of her misery with his hand held like a pointed gun. We're near the end. There is a certain symmetry between these apparent poles in a performance spectrum, between Florence's hand raised in tears and Gwyneth Paltrow's grip on the token of her accomplishment beyond tears. The nature of this culture is an imperative to return to the pack, The more exceptional Paltrow becomes, and the Oscars are a trademark of extracting individuality from ensemble, the more will this very setting become the place where she seeks the pact of her relations. The moment she grasps Oscar, the strangely featureless, handless, robotic doyen of acting excellence, she becomes deterritorialized, descending back into the galaxy of stars within which she rotates, waiting for recognition, where she belongs. There was a lot made of the fact that Gwyneth Paltrow cried, but of course she did not shed tears. But when did she ever shed tears? In 5 sad scenes in Shakespeare in Love, I've seen it in slow motion, she manages just the one. On hearing of the apparent betrayal of her suitor, a tear, a single tear, breaks free from her right eye and edges across her cheek. Veritable lachrymosity. This is not abnormal, but anonymous. It links her with the beasts, who cannot shed tears, but cry out. The more exceptional Florence becomes, on the other hand, the more she returns to the path of her anonymity, among the flock who are undulating downstage left. There she turns from me and us, her hands slowly dropping from on high, to below where it becomes the third leg, and presses towards a more intimate, true and tender communion. The shepherd, the 6-year-old sadist, has finally turned up, and the narrative performance becomes the instinct to avoid his wielded crook, and the over-enthusiastic sheepdog, his mate, who Judases on the non-human gathering with exaggerated yelps and barks. Above and beyond this bucolic scene, an angel appears. I bring you good news of great joy. And in that moment, Aesop turns slowly beneath that cliff at Delphi, as the animal gives way to the herd, corralled into the corner, to ensure the Christian, humanist message holds centre stage. Here we herald adieu to the imperative performance, and welcome the generous hospitality of the theatre, where one can never be sure of what we are witnessing is raving or good old-fashioned drama. The last part, a very brief section by way of conclusion, acclamation. A year has passed. A child of 6 who still happens to be our daughter walks from somewhere off to somewhere on and accustoms herself to being watched. Once more, and maybe for the last time from the stage, her hand rises to welcome us, but now more modestly cradled within the bounds of her own azure outline, so as not to draw attention to her recalcitrant private presence beyond her secondary role. The virgin birth is successfully negotiated, while Joseph stands frozen downstage looking shifty. In a final tableau, a member of my family and other animals group around the sire, as the congregation, only too aware now of their status as unlearned laity, begin to sing a final carol. In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made merry. Christina Rossetti speaks to these outsiders, this audience, when in the final stanzas of her 1880s poem she writes, "What can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would bring a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. Yet what can I give him? Give my heart." In Gustav Holst's musical accompaniment, the final line has become, "Give my heart," with 3 distinct parts, a last imperative. The line might have been softened by "give him my heart," but Rossetti knows there is more at stake here than a simple offering. There is an imperative of performance. The act of saying is a performative here. For belief, as Judith Butler reminded us at the outset this evening, resides in the saying, the address, the assertion of what is right, not an object. Outside the stable, beyond the angels and the archangels, the cherubim and the seraphim, the laity offer their own gifts, cheaper than gold, incense and myrrh may be, but somehow more meaningful, just close enough to the mother, who in her maiden bliss worship the beloved with a kiss. The mothers in the audience raise their hands and blow across the surface of the path to bestow on their own infants their blessing. The cast looked stunned, woebegone, bewildered, experiencing the oblivion of the animal, destined to be in the world, but not of the world. They hold their hands to their faces, peering through a two-forked angle between their fingers, a red to us on the far side. Applause, acclamation, recognition compounds the melancholia of separation. The poet Rilke acknowledges this imperative performance in the infancy of theatre when he says, "In the alert, warm animal, there lies the pain and burden of an enormous sadness, for it too feels the presence of what often overwhelms us, a memory, as if the element we keep pressing towards was once more intimate, more true, and our communion infinitely tender. Here, all is distance. There, it was breath." Thank you for coming, for listening, and for watching. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Dominique for a remarkable performance. Thank you to Calvin for giving me confidence that IT actually can work seamlessly in Kings. And another great performance. And thank you, I think, to Alan's family, to his daughters, for allowing him to do it. He's just done. Wonderful daughterly devotion. So it's my duty now to introduce Professor Joe Kelleher, who is going to give the vote of thanks. Before that, I want to just remind you that there will be a drinks reception in chapters on the second level after this, to which you are all very welcome. I hope we can see you there. So I'm delighted to welcome and to introduce Professor Joe Kelleher, who will give the vote of thanks. He's Professor of Theatre and Performance at the University of Roehampton, where he is also Head of Department of Drama. Professor Kelleher works largely on contemporary European experimental theatre, and his books include Theatre and Politics, The Theatre of Societas Raffaele Sanzio, with Castellucci, Guidi and Rideout, and Contemporary Theatres in Europe, again with Rideout. And he's also been with a number of collaborators and maker of performance. So Professor Joe Kelleher to offer the vote of thanks.
This will be shorter than the last thing you've heard. The middle bits I'm going to extemporise. The ending and the beginning I've written down. And the first thing I've written down is the sentence, "Alan, that was brilliant." I guess some promises of performance weren't prepared to put up on spectator. This was one, after reading the paper last time. Thanks. I say thanks now. I'm going to say it again in 5 minutes' time. And then we can all go for a drink and a vol au vent maybe, and put our ill-adapted persons to the test at being social and or amongst the sociality, being alone, however the mood might take us. Being social and being alone. Perhaps I start with that. It's what happens at the theatre. And I think one of the things you do, Alan, in your work, your reading, your thinking, your writing and speaking is you take us to the theatre. You conjure for us a mental theatre, as you did this evening, that never fails to acknowledge its debt to those real theatres made by the real artists, whoever they might be, the stage hands on whom our work and our pleasure depends. But, I say, you conjure a theatre, and you invite us to attend. For example, you invite us to attend to that wide opening along the side of Plato's cave that was always there, staring us in the face, as it were, but which now, as ever in the theatre, we arrive at again, I guess as Freddie Roper might say, again as if for the first time. And you persuade us to look. You persuade us, I would suggest, to look at. You might also persuade us to look inside, but I think more than anything, you persuade us to look at. And, to echo your own question, what do we see in the cave? I'd say it's like the whole complex machinery. Not just the shadows flickering on the far wall were now the show. I.e., the shadows, but also the captive audience of spectators who are not ourselves, and whom we may, if we want to fool ourselves about this, we might imagine as less sceptical, more foolish and foolable than ourselves. But then, not just the shadows, not just the captive spectators, not just the labouring puppeteer stagehands, but ourselves also. We're part of the machinery too. The ones looking in. We too are part of the machinery that we find in this theatre. So, we see all this, and what else do we see? Or what else, to echo Christina Rossetti's hymn, are we given? Well, as always, in your work, Alan, we are given detail. And detail that sticks. I think Jonathan Pryce's hands will continue to trouble me in my reads tonight and maybe present my methods. But as well as detail, you give us also attention to detail. That's kind of just the one thing I want to say is that, actually. And the quality of attention, I think, is something that matters. An attention that puts pressure on things, pressures them to appear and to speak for themselves, but also an attention, let's say, that loves, i.e., that attends to what comes forward of itself, like a wren, like the patch of yellow in the painting, to take one famous example which I know you're aware of, or the movement of the young man, beautiful in these movements, who passes back and forth through the lasso. It takes perhaps a certain sort of loving look, but an impersonal look, a look that respects, an unconditional look, to attend to what may appear, what may come forward in a theatre such as this. And then I want to tell an anecdote, because I think we're here on a theatre occasion, there should be an anecdote. Just the extent of it. So, the last time I saw Salatika's piece Lasso was also the first time I saw it. And that was earlier this summer, and I was in the company of our mutual friend Nicholas Rydat over there, little scratching his head. And we were in one of your parts of the world, Alan. We were in Provence, in Avignon. And either the next day, or I think that same evening, we were due to meet with yourself, and Beryl, and Florence, and Hermione. And we were going to see two shows by two of the companies that have most sustained our thinking, I think, such as Raffaello Sanzio, Romeo Castellucci's company, and Force Entertainment. And both were brilliant. While waiting for you, me and Nick went into Avignon's Modern Art Gallery, the Collection Lambert. And we found a room, and Nick, I think, said, "This is great, stay for this." And it was Lasso, the show there. And so me and Nick are there, and one of those little sort of benches you get in these modern art galleries, and we're sat there entranced with the images, just like the captives in the Platonic cave. And we watch the thing through till almost like the last seconds, absolutely absorbed. And then we are interrupted, disastrously interrupted. A guide, a museum guide, comes in with a big group of tourists or visitors and starts declaiming very loudly, very brutally, we thought, what the damn artwork is supposed to be about, and its provenance and all the rest of it. And it just kind of broke things. So, I continue on the end. If this was an example of the enlightened returning to the cave with sure knowledge to share with us poor captives, me and Nick, and anyone else in earshot, the truth, and persuade us to leave, well, it worked. We got up and left, and I haven't seen Ticker's work again until this evening. There's also, of course, more to say about this. The guide, like any stagehand, is also doing her job. Not to everyone's satisfaction, but she's doing her job. There will also always, and your work I think has taught us this, be occasions when the preciousness of our attention is apt to be interrupted, to be unsettled by what else is there in the room too. Not just bursting in from outside, but also what is there already in the room, but maybe unattended. But even so, Alan, this is the home straight here, but that's on 50 words. Even so, Alan, when you return to the cave, as you do this evening, to tell us things, to show us things, to profess and perform and teach us, I think you do so differently than the guy that collects your money. And I think what you do does have to do, amongst many other things, with a quality of attention to the detail, to what is there, but also the distances that separate us from what is there. Distances across which we might intuit devastating closeness. I don't use the word devastating lightly. Devastating closeness, and that's the stakes are high. Familiarity even, but familiarity with what is strange to us, which is where we find the human when it's good. But where also, and this is harder to articulate, but I shall give it a go, where whenever we hear you doing what you do, as we did this evening, I say we enjoy finding ourselves amongst others who are hearing and enjoying the same thing. Each of us, if you will, listening with our own ears, seeing with our own eyes, thinking and feeling acutely whatever each of us is inclined to think and feel, not what we're told to think and feel. For which, and I say this now on behalf of us all, much thanks. And it's time now for us, I think, to put our hands, our paws, our appendages together. Thanks a lot.